The frigid March morning of 2013 began with a quiet disturbance on Mill Street in the suburbs of Bangor, Maine. 5 unmarked police cars silently pulled up in front of a ground-floor apartment, painted ash gray, where a man had lived a reclusive life for nearly 2 decades. Neighbors peered through their curtains as officers in heavy winter jackets positioned themselves around the building in absolute silence. Inside, 45-year-old Ethan Rowe was making his morning coffee, a simple routine he had maintained faithfully ever since moving here to work at a local machine shop. At exactly 6:20 a.m., there was a sharp knock on the door. "Ethan Rowe, Vermont State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1986 disappearance of Rachel Linden." The officers later recounted that the man's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup, but his face remained eerily calm, as if he had always known that one day the old Vermont snow would melt and unearth the secret he had tried to bury for nearly 30 years. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In late 1986, Vermont entered one of the harshest winters in over a decade. Snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing rooftops, streets, and the ancient pine trees lining Route 73, turning the tiny town of Cedar Hollow into a silent white ribbon nestled in the valley. Life here revolved around dairy farms, sawmills, and lumber mills along Otter Creek. Residents were accustomed to the cold and the predictable rhythm of the seasons, mowing grass in summer, harvesting in fall, and hunkering down in winter until the snow melted. Crime was virtually non-existent, and for years the local police had only dealt with minor fender benders or domestic disputes. Teenagers in the area usually picked up after-school jobs to help their parents, mostly at fast food joints, gas stations, or the small grocery store in town. Among them was 16-year-old Rachel Linden, a senior at Cedar Hollow High School. She was energetic but quiet, and she worked the evening shift at the Wendy's located right on the road leading out to the suburbs. Rachel lived with her parents and younger brother in a 2-story wooden house about 5 miles from work. Every night she came home on time, except on days when heavy snow made the roads slippery or the car slow to start. On Friday night, December 12th, snow had been falling since early in the day, so thick that it piled up to the tops of boots on the roads. The restaurant was nearly empty, but Rachel stayed to clean up as required. Around 10 p.m., the lights inside gradually went out, leaving only the faint yellow glow spilling onto the parking lot. A coworker saw her pull on her dark green winter coat, wrap a wool scarf around her neck, wave goodbye to everyone, and step outside. At the edge of the lot, Ethan Rowe's silver sedan, an 18-year-old former classmate 2 years ahead of her, was waiting. They had known each other since junior high, still talked occasionally, and sometimes Ethan gave her a ride home after her shift. When Rachel opened the car door, the wind whipped up a swirl of snow that blurred the glowing Wendy's sign in the rearview mirror. A truck driver passing by later said he saw the silver car turn onto a narrow side road leading toward Maple Ridge Lake, where dark forests surrounded the water that had already begun to freeze. After that, no one ever saw Rachel again. The next morning, with thick snow piled on the front porch, her mother went upstairs to wake her, but the room was empty. The bed hadn't been slept in, the desk lamp was still on, and the spare jacket she usually wore home from work was still draped over the chair. Her parents called the restaurant and were told Rachel had left the night before. They called friends, neighbors, and even the local hospital. No one had any news. All day long, pickup trucks passing along the main road left fresh tire tracks, but no one had seen the girl. By the time darkness fell over Cedar Hollow again, the wind whistling through the pines seemed to echo the strange silence that had settled over the Linden house. With no other options left, Rachel's father finally picked up the phone and dialed the town police station to report that his daughter had vanished into the snowy night. The call from the Linden family was logged at the Cedar Hollow Dispatch Center just before 9 p.m. The duty officer, a 15-year veteran, listened to Mr. Linden's frantic voice interspersed with sharp breaths and the sound of wind whistling through the phone booth. The report was immediately forwarded to the sheriff's office. Tom Keene, who had served the town for more than 20 years, was at headquarters when the first facts rolled out of the old machine in the duty room. He quickly scanned the lines. Female, 16 years old, missing since the previous night, last seen at Wendy's, never made it home. In the handwritten notes section was a scrawled line: family reports bad weather, no signs of argument or voluntary runaway. Keene set the paper down, pulled on a thick wool coat, and stepped out of his office. Outside, snow was still falling heavily, the pale yellow streetlights casting hazy streaks through the freezing fog. He ordered the duty officer to call in 2 more night shift deputies and to open a new case file coded "Missing Juvenile, Rachel Linden." Before the clock struck 10, the first patrol unit was dispatched to sweep the town center, Wendy's, the bus depot, the South Side residential area, and the local hospital. Patrol cars crawled along the ice-covered roads, their spinning lights reflecting off the patchy snow. At the bus depot, the night attendant confirmed no girl matching the description had bought a ticket out of town in the past 2 days. The hospital admission list had no Rachel Linden. Another team canvassed the neighborhood near the high school, knocking on the doors of her close friends. No one knew anything. That night, every lid led nowhere. Keene wrote in the log, no indication of voluntary runaway, no witnesses, no vehicle recorded in the downtown area. Back at the office, he looked up at the wall map, where Cedar Hollow's narrow roads crisscrossed around Maple Ridge Forest and Lake Dunmore to the west. It was late, but he still had the admin desk draft an internal memo to state police notifying them of the preliminary missing teen report under dangerous weather conditions. At the Linden home, 2 officers were sent to take formal statements from Rachel's parents, detailing the clothes she was wearing when she left and her daily routine. Mrs. Linden handed them a photo of her daughter, taken at junior high graduation, shoulder-length hair, gentle smile. One of the officers taped the picture into the corner of the newly opened file. Near midnight, after compiling the initial reports, Keene decided the situation could not wait. He called the head of the local volunteer search and rescue team to prepare vehicles and manpower for a ground search the next morning around the Maple Ridge Lake area, the last reported direction of the car the witness had seen. The urgent order was brief: sweep the entire route connecting downtown to the west, expanding a 5-mile radius from intersection 12. As he left headquarters, Keene paused at the door, watching the snow pile higher and the faint glow of lights through the freezing fog. A heavy sense of dread settled in his chest. This disappearance would not be as simple as the usual lost in the snow cases every winter. Early the next morning, while fog still blanketed the valley and light snow continued to fall, Cedar Hollow's first search team assembled in the parking lot behind Town Hall. More than 20 people, town police, volunteer rescuers, and a few locals who knew the Lindens, bundled in heavy coats and gloves, readying their gear. Sheriff Tom Keene personally took command. He spread a map over the hood of a Jeep and marked in red the route from Wendy's to Rachel's house, along with the side roads branching into Maple Ridge Forest. According to the witness, this was the last place Ethan Rowe's silver car had been seen. Keene divided the group into 3 teams, one to follow the main road west, one to check the smaller turnoffs, and one to work with tracking dogs along the forest edge. The temperature hovered at 12 degrees Celsius, and the fresh 10-centimeter layer of snow made movement slow and laborious. Around 8 a.m., the convoy left downtown, driving nose to tail on the icy road, headlights cutting dull beams through the fog. About 3 miles from Maple Ridge Lake, the lead team stopped when they spotted deep tire tracks in the snow. Keene stepped out and examined them closely. 2 narrow ruts matching a small sedan. He had an officer measure the track width and take photos, then marked the spot with a wooden stake. From that point, the tracks continued another 200 meters before disappearing into the woods. The direction was north, straight toward Maple Ridge. Faint footprints nearby were almost completely covered by drifting snow. Keene ordered all vehicles to halt and preserve the scene. He radioed the second team to block the far end of the forest access road to prevent contamination of evidence. The tracking dog was brought in, nose to the snow, circling the area before stopping 50 meters from the tree line and giving a short bark. There was no scent of blood or discarded items, but the dog's reaction indicated someone had recently been there. Keene noted the coordinates and ordered the survey team to set an initial 1-mile search radius around the forest. While volunteers strung yellow caution tape, wind off the lake carried icy moisture that thickened the fog. Everyone worked in silence, broken only by radio chatter and the crunch of boots on snow. By mid-morning, the tire track area was fully cordoned off with yellow ribbon. At the temporary command post set up roadside, Keene radioed State Police headquarters, tire tracks consistent with suspect vehicle description, location near Maple Ridge Forest. No evidence of crime yet, but possible connection to Rachel Linden disappearance. He instructed the duty officer to log the discovery time and send all scene photos back to headquarters for the file. When the weak sun finally peeked through the trees, Keene signaled the teams to pull back for a short break, agreeing to push deeper into the forest that afternoon. Before leaving, he glanced back at the dark rows of snow-laden trees, a chill running down his spine that wasn't just from the wind. Years of instinct told him the path into those woods might mark the start of the hardest case of his career. Early that afternoon, as the search teams returned to Maple Ridge Forest to extend the sweep northward, the snow had stopped and the sky had turned a dull gray. They used the morning tire tracks as their reference point. A 3-man team led by Lieutenant Mark Halpern followed the old tracks another 200 meters deeper into the woods, when they spotted a faint glint behind a cluster of birch trees. Approaching carefully, they saw the snow-covered roof of a silver sedan parked crookedly between two trunks, nose pointed deeper into the forest. Halpern immediately radioed Sheriff Keene to report the discovery and secure the area. The car was almost perfectly intact, doors closed, no collision damage, a light dusting of snow on the windshield and hood, front wheels half buried in fluffy ice. From every angle, there were no skid marks or drag marks indicating loss of control. It looked deliberately parked. Keene arrived quickly with 2 officers. He ordered yellow tape strung in a 30-meter radius and began photographing the scene with a 35mm film camera. Everyone kept their distance to avoid leaving footprints near the vehicle. After brushing snow from the windows, they could see inside the cabin, front seats neatly adjusted. Gear shift in park, keys still in the ignition, but engine off, no signs of forced entry. Doors locked, handles unscratched, headlights off. A thin layer of snow on the floor mats had blown in through cracks, confirming the car had been abandoned, at least since the previous night. On the back seat lay a folded paper bag, some old receipts, and a dark-colored coat. Keene jotted quick notes and numbered each observed item, but did not allow anyone to open the doors yet. He contacted State Police to request a forensic unit for standard vehicle processing. While waiting, he and the trail team continued sweeping the surrounding area. Aside from faint footprints now mostly covered by fresh snow, there were no drag marks or dropped items. About 15 meters behind the car, the snow was depressed in an oval shape, as if someone had stood or sat there for a while. Keene staked that spot, then returned to the car. He checked the license plate and confirmed it belonged to Ethan Rowe, registered at an address on the same street as the Lindens. The information was added to the scene report, along with the discovery time of 13:45. Around 3 p.m., the state forensic team arrived, conducted a preliminary examination, and sealed the entire vehicle with white nylon tape. They noted no blood, no signs of struggle, interior undisturbed. However, a vehicle abandoned in the woods during extreme weather was deemed highly irregular. Keene signed paperwork upgrading the case from missing juvenile to suspicious disappearance, and ordered the area preserved for detailed forensic analysis. As the sun sank low, weak golden light filtered through the ice-covered branches and glinted off the car's cold metal surface. Keene stood staring at the silver sedan for a long moment before turning away. a vague feeling rising that this car was not just the only lid. It was the first boundary between a simple missing person case and something far more complicated. After the car was sealed and towed to the impound lot, Sheriff Tom Keene expanded the investigation into the civilian sphere. The next morning, he and Lieutenant Halpern went to Wendy's to interview the employees who had worked the same evening shift as Rachel. Inside, the heaters roared, windows fogged with condensation, and the air was thick with the smell of grease and coffee. A weary workday atmosphere. The three employees were questioned separately. All confirmed Rachel left around 10 p.m. after finishing kitchen cleanup. A young coworker named Marla said she saw the headlights of Ethan Rowe's silver car in the parking lot and heard Rachel say, "He's here to pick me up." No one saw her return after that. Keene carefully noted every detail of timing, witnesses, and vehicle description. Before leaving, he asked to review shift logs and the old security cameras. But the manager said the system had been broken for over a year, only paper timesheets remained. Rachel's name was on the list, clock out time 21:58. At the same moment, Ethan Rowe was remembered at the gas station across the street, where the clerk recalled a young guy who bought coffee and stood outside for quite a while. Keene immediately had Ethan brought in for questioning. The young man arrived looking exhausted, wearing a green army jacket, hair disheveled, hands ice cold. In the small interview room, Keene kept his tone calm and started with basic questions. "When was the last time you saw Rachel?" Ethan answered slowly, saying he had dropped her off at the intersection near the Miller farm, about 2 miles from her house, and that she wanted to walk the rest of the way because she liked walking in the snow. When Keene asked why he didn't drive her all the way home, Ethan said the roads were too slippery and the car was sliding, so he didn't want to turn deeper into the residential area. The statement was recorded and signed, but several details raised red flags for Keene. First, the route Ethan described did not match the direction the car was found in Maple Ridge Forest. Second, the departure time Ethan gave, around 9:30, was nearly 30 minutes earlier than the timesheet. When confronted, Ethan claimed he might have misremembered because his car clock was wrong. Lieutenant Halpern, sitting beside him, noted in the margin, voice shaky, avoids direct eye contact. Keene asked more about their relationship. Ethan insisted they were just old classmates who talked occasionally and had no conflicts. When asked why he was at the restaurant that night, he said he happened to be driving by and stopped to give her a ride because she was running late. The interview lasted over an hour. There was no direct evidence against Ethan, but the inconsistencies in timing and direction were added to the report. Keene ended the session by ordering Ethan to remain in the area until the investigation concluded. On the drive back to the office, he reread the transcript, his unease growing. The young man's answers weren't outright lies, but they lacked consistency, like he was struggling to keep his story from falling apart. At the station, the statement was copied, one for the local file, one sent to state police. Keene sat at his desk, staring at the map with its red line from Wendy's to the Miller Farm intersection, then onward to Maple Ridge Forest where the car was found. To him, that straight line wasn't just a route, it was a chain of unanswered questions. When he finally left the office, snow had started falling again outside, thickly covering the few remaining tire tracks from the day before, erasing every trace as if the town itself was trying to keep someone's secret. The morning after, as the first feeble light filtered through the eastern tree line, the expanded search team was officially deployed under coordination between the Cedar Hollow Town Police, state troopers, and volunteer rescue groups. The priority area was the strip of land around Maple Ridge Lake, where gently sloping hills interspersed with young birch and pine forests, laced with numerous trails leading deep inside. Sheriff Tom Keene divided the entire manpower into 5 teams, each consisting of 4 to 5 people, equipped with walkie-talkies, topographic maps, and handheld flashlights. 2 K9 unit dogs from the state were brought in. Their handlers let them sniff a wool scarf of Rachel's taken from her home, then began leading them along the lakeside road. A cold wind blew hard, The half-frozen lake surface reflected silvery light, creating a thick, opaque mist that severely limited visibility. The teams moved slowly, marking every point of interest with red-painted wooden stakes. Each sector was swept thoroughly. Volunteers poked beneath the snow with sticks, while the tracking dogs circled the forest edge. Around 10 o'clock, the Western team led by Lieutenant Halpern reported an unusual find. About 400 meters from the lake's edge, a small white object stood out against the backdrop of dead trees. A thin piece of nylon cord caught on a low branch, roughly 30 centimeters long. One end lightly twisted, the middle abraded as if it had been yanked hard. Halpern halted the formation, marked the coordinates, and using gloved hands picked up the cord and placed it into an evidence bag. He radioed Keene, possible related item located, requesting logging and collection. When Keene arrived, he closely examined the area. The surrounding ground was flat, with only a few faint old footprints and no other objects. The cord was sealed in a clear plastic bag, labeled Evidence A623, and signed by 2 witnesses. The tracking dogs were brought over to sniff the area, but showed no strong reaction, indicating the item no longer carried a fresh human scent. Keene ordered photographs of the entire discovery site, including the branch, wind direction, and the cord's resting angle. He directed one team to measure the distance from this spot to where the car had been found the previous day, nearly 700 meters, as the crow flies. On the map, the 2 points were connected by a straight red line running along a narrow northern trail around the lake, prompting him to note possible same travel route. From noon through the afternoon, the search continued, expanding a 1-mile radius around the lake. Patrol groups fanned out in wedge patterns, combing every slope, rock crevice and thicket. Several items were logged: bottles, scraps of cloth, sticks, but none were relevant. By 3 o'clock, the temperature dropped sharply and cold wind thickened the fog. Keene signaled the entire team to return to the temporary command post set up on a clearing. The nylon cord was handed over to the evidence officer with full documentation of time, location, collector, and condition. He stressed that preservation must be absolute and the item transported directly to the Rutland lab that same day for fiber structure and surface trace analysis. While everyone packed up gear, Keene stood staring at the map, spread across a wooden table, where 2 red marks stood out against the vast white expanse of forest and lake. In that scene, he felt a vague connection between the abandoned car and the small piece of cord just recovered. 2 disconnected fragments of the same unfinished story, and the only thing he could do now was keep the search going before night once again fell over Cedar Hollow. The next day, while the nylon cord sample was sent to the state lab, Sheriff Tom Keene directed the investigative team to trace the material's origin. From experience, white twisted pair nylon cord of that type was commonly sold at farm supply stores for tying loads, hanging tools, or securing lumber. Cedar Hollow and nearby towns had a total of 7 outlets carrying it, all along Route 73 toward Brandon. Keene and Lieutenant Halpern started with the closest town, logging each store and asking about transactions in the week before the disappearance. Most owners said the cord was a high-volume item and they couldn't recall individual customers. However, at Caldwell's Supply on the south side of Brandon, an old established shop specializing in rope farm implements and metal hardware, the owner, Arthur Caldwell, clearly remembered. He said that on the morning of December 10th, a young man around 18, tall, wearing a green army jacket, came in and bought 20 feet of nylon rope, paying cash. When Keene pressed for details, Caldwell pulled an old handwritten sales ledger from a drawer and flipped to an entry. E. Rowe, nylon rope 20 feet, $3.75, written in scratchy but legible script, with PD, noted below in blue ink. Keene requested a photocopy of the receipt, photographed the ledger page, and obtained Caldwell's verbal confirmation. Caldwell was certain the buyer was the same young man the town had been talking about for days because the face had stuck with him. Quiet kid, didn't say much, just asked which rope was strongest and stretched least when pulled tight. The description caught Keen's attention. He asked whether anything else had been purchased. Caldwell said no, just the rope, cut to exactly 20 feet. All details were carefully recorded, with the transaction time estimated at around 8:30 a.m., 2 days before the night Rachel vanished. Back at the station, Keen had the ledger signature compared to Ethan Rowe's earlier statement handwriting. The slant and pen pressure matched, strongly indicating the same person. The receipt copy and interview record were stamped, Caldwell's supply, witness statement, and placed in a supplemental evidence envelope labeled a 624. Keen sat staring at the bold Ethan Rowe on the thin sheet, feeling the thread linking the fragments he'd gathered over the past week grow clearer. The car abandoned in the woods, the nylon cord found on the branch, and now a receipt for rope purchased 2 days before the disappearance. He ordered the staff to compile everything into a supplemental report for the state police and added source verification, rope purchase confirmed, to the case file. That afternoon, the photocopy of the receipt was pinned into the ever-thickening folder on his desk, next to the map now covered in red dots. In the fading late afternoon light, Keen flipped back to his own handwritten note, rope, discovery location, Caldwell's store. Rowe confirmed. Everything now lined up in a straight, simple but unnatural path, and with years of experience he knew that when small details started fitting together too perfectly, it was no longer coincidence. 2 days after confirmation from Caldwell's supply, Sheriff Tom Keen completed the paperwork for a search warrant of suspect Ethan Rowe's residence. The warrant was signed by the Addison County judge that morning, authorizing a full search of the house and the detached shed behind it. As soon as it was approved, Keen, Lieutenant Halpern, and 2 state troopers drove to the Rowe family address on the north side of Cedar Hollow, an old 2-story wooden house right at the forest's edge, surrounded by uneven, ice-covered ground. The sky was overcast, snow falling lightly. The scene so quiet the crunch of boots on ice was clearly audible. Ethan was home when the team arrived, looking exhausted, eyes ringed with dark circles, and offered no resistance as Keen read the warrant aloud. Inside, the house was tidy but cold, damp, and still smelling of wood smoke. Officers split up and began searching. Living room, upstairs bedrooms, then the shed. In a metal cabinet in the basement, Halpern found a coil of white nylon rope about 10 feet long, smooth surface, same twisted pear gauge as the evidence recovered at Maple Ridge. He noted the rope was intact, cleanly cut at the ends, no fraying, neatly coiled inside a personal toolbox. In the same cabinet corner was a pair of high-top leather boots, caked with dark, frozen mud. The tread pattern clearly showed an arrow design that matched the faint footprints logged near the abandoned silver car. All items were photographed and sealed per procedure. Rope labeled a 625, boots a 626. Hanging in the bedroom closet was the green army jacket described by Caldwell, heavy fabric, fur-lined collar, faded logo on the left pocket. Keen took it down for preliminary inspection. No blood or tears, just a few dried mud spots on the cuffs. When Halpern asked Ethan about the rope coil, the young man answered curtly that it was for tying stuff in the truck bed. The explanation was recorded, but Keen made no comment. He instructed an officer to collect soil samples around the property for comparison with the boot mud. The shed behind the house contained only ordinary mechanical items, a few old paint cans, and worn tires, no signs of disturbance or anything unusual. The search lasted nearly 3 hours and concluded in early afternoon. Before leaving, Keen read the inventory of seized items aloud and had Ethan sign acknowledgement. He signed quickly in shaky handwriting, then stood silently staring out the window. Keen observed without speaking, jotting in his notebook, cooperative but flat effect. As the convoy pulled away, he told Halpern to take all evidence straight to headquarters and forward it immediately to the Rutland State Lab for fiber and soil analysis. By end of day, the search report was finalized. 3 items seized, chain of custody intact, no blood or direct signs of violence. Keen signed the last page slowly, then looked out the window where snow was beginning to fall heavily again. The details he now held, rope fragment, boots, jacket, were not yet enough to conclude anything, but they all pointed in the same silent, clear, and icy direction as the snow-covered road back to Maple Ridge. 3 days after the evidence reached the Rutland lab, a preliminary report was sent back to Cedar Hollow Police Headquarters. A thin typed sheet on an old Olympia typewriter, stamped in red Forensic Division, Vermont State Lab, at the top corner. Sheriff Tom Keene read every line under the dim light of his office, while the wall clock ticked steadily, and outside the window lay a silent blanket of snow. The report stated clearly, the nylon cord sample recovered at Maple Ridge, and the coil found at suspect Ethan Rowe's residence shared the same double-twist construction, 4 mm diameter, and 98% polymer composition match under spectroscopic analysis. Milky white color, identical UV reflectance, slight surface abrasion from mechanical friction. However, the conclusion was underlined in black ink. Cannot confirm both samples originated from the identical spool. Current data only establishes common commercial manufacture. Keene stared at those words, feeling the familiar letdown when the clearest leads lacked legal weight. The report further noted, no biological traces or foreign substances detected on either sample. Current technology does not permit organic microtrace analysis. In 1986, the state lab still relied on basic optical and chemical methods, no DNA testing or laser microfiber comparison. The samples were deemed the same type but insufficient for criminal attribution. Keene set the report down and looked through the thick case file where statements, search reports, and crime scene photos were stacked high. He knew that prosecuting required more than technical coincidences. All that afternoon he and Lieutenant Halpern re-examined every piece of evidence: car location, rope purchase receipt, witness statements, rope coil at the residence, everything aligned yet still missing the final link. No blood, no body, no direct evidence of assault. When Keene contacted the Addison County Prosecutor's Office, the response was cautious. Insufficient grounds for charges, criminal act not established. The short, firm answer put a temporary period on 2 weeks of intense effort. That night, Keene signed the order, lifting surveillance of suspect Ethan Rowe. The short-term detention expired, and by regulation, the young man was free to leave the station. As Ethan stepped outside, the night wind whipped his face and snow fell quietly across the lot. He said nothing, only glanced briefly at Keene, then walked straight toward the icy road. Keene stood on the steps watching, a lingering unease settling in his mind, like cold creeping under his collar. In his personal log, he wrote a single line, rope matches type, insufficient evidence. Keep file open. Monitor discreetly. The next day the case file was moved to a metal cabinet in archives, numbered 86 M214, tagged red pending verification. The final report entry read, no criminal indicators at this time. Recommend continued monitoring if new information arises. The Rachel Linden missing person case, after nearly 3 weeks of intense investigation, officially entered suspended status. Patrol cars left the Maple Ridge area. Yellow tape was taken down, and winter snow once again covered the last remaining traces, as if no one had ever walked there. 1 week after the forensic report arrived, Sheriff Tom Keene still could not shake his obsession with Maple Ridge Lake. Everything he had pointed to the same place, the abandoned car, the matching type rope coil, and Ethan Rowe's inconsistent statements. No crime indicators, yet also no evidence Rachel Linden had left town alive. The weather had briefly eased, a thin melt exposed patches of dark water between ice floes. Keene decided to organize a new underwater survey with help from the state dive team. On the morning of December 28th, a rescue crew of 4 divers and 2 surface technicians arrived at Maple Ridge, set up a temporary camp on the shore, started generators, and rigged anchor systems. The air was bitterly cold, around -8 degrees Celsius, breath turning to white clouds. Keene and Lieutenant Halpern monitored from the bank, while the dive team drilled circular ice holes and lowered guidelines to probe the bottom. Underwater visibility was nearly zero, Mud, algae, and floating ice fragments restricted headlamps to a 2-meter range. Each time a diver surfaced, they reported only rocks, rotten branches, and a few rusted cans. After more than an hour, near the northern edge, one diver signaled a soft object tangled in weeds. When it was brought up, it was a dark green piece of fabric, roughly 30 by 40 centimeters, edges frayed and coated in thick mud. Keene immediately ordered it sealed in an evidence bag, coded A627. Once rinsed, the color matched the jacket Rachel had worn the night she vanished. A Wendy's employee called to the lake, confirmed exact same color and material as the uniform she wore that night. The entire search team paused in silence for several minutes, only the wind whistling across the ice. Keene ordered 2 more dives within a 50-meter radius of the find, but nothing else turned up. The lake depth there was nearly 8 meters, with deep silt and no large covered objects. By late afternoon, the sky turned lead gray, and a strong east wind brought fresh snow. Keene called an end to diving and ordered all gear recovered. The fabric piece was handed to the field technician for preservation, along with adhering mud samples for comparison. He looked across the lake, now shrouded in dense mist, the morning's ice holes already refreezing, sealing every trace just made. The search report was completed inside the Jeep. No body or criminal evidence located at lake bottom. Recovered item believed to be portion of female jacket, color matched to victim's clothing. Keene's final note read, "Adverse weather, survey suspended." As the convoy departed, dusk fell quickly, leaving only a long white expanse between forest and dark water. Keene glanced back through the rearview mirror where the vehicle lights briefly reflected off the lake surface like a short streak before vanishing. He knew that after that day, Maple Ridge would again be buried in snow, and with it any remaining hope of finding another sign of Rachel Linden would sink beneath the thickening ice. In early January 1987, heavy snow returned, completely halting any further search around Maple Ridge Lake. Access roads into the forest were blocked by knee-deep ice, and the lake surface was solidly frozen, making additional surveys impossible. After more than 3 straight weeks of investigation, all Cedar Hollow police had to show was an abandoned car, a matching type nylon rope segment, a dark green fabric scrap, and contradictory statements without legal weight. No body, no direct evidence of crime. The Rachel Linden disappearance had reached the limits of investigation. Sheriff Tom Keene spent the entire afternoon of January 6th finalizing the summary report. In his small office, lit by yellow light, he reviewed every page of the file, checked signatures, marked evidence items, and noted preservation status. The final report was concise. No indicators of violence detected, insufficient basis for criminal charges. Recommend temporary case closure pending new information. The header, Suspended Case #861204, was typed in bold, followed by the red seal of the Cedar Hollow Police Department. The file was fastened with a metal clip and taken down to the basement archive at Town Hall, shelved among hundreds of other civil matters. Keene signed the report, then sat motionless at his desk for a long while, as a quiet sense of failure crept in with the steady tick of the clock. He had hoped for at least one clear trace, but every path ended in snow and silence. That same day, the Addison County Prosecutor's Office sent written confirmation of suspended investigation, adding a recommendation to continue monitoring suspect connections if suspicious activity arises. Ethan Rowe was informed formal surveillance had ended. The young man left Cedar Hollow a few weeks later, telling neighbors he was moving to live with relatives in Maine to find work. No one stopped him, and no one asked further questions. When winter finally ended and Maple Ridge ice melted, the search was never resumed. On Keene's desk, the map with its faded red dots was rolled up and placed in a metal tube. On March 12th, he wrote the last entry in the duty log. No further developments. Case 861204 remained suspended. That night the snow stopped. The town returned to the same quiet it had known before everything began, leaving only the emptiness of a name still unfound, buried somewhere beneath the Vermont cold. On the morning of April 4th, 2013, Nearly 27 years after case file 861204 had been consigned to storage, a local hunter named Richard Foley, while tracking spring deer sign, entered the wooded area north of Maple Ridge Lake. The snow had melted, the ground was still damp, and dry leaves mixed with mud and protruding roots created uneven terrain. When he reached a low rocky slope beside the lake, Foley noticed something silver glinting in a crevice, reflecting the sunlight. Thinking it was a piece of a can or metal debris, he bent down, gently brushed away the layer of decayed leaves and clinging soil with his walking stick. But what appeared made him freeze. A small, smooth bone, with the clear structure of a human bone, lay among dark fabric scraps and dried moss. Next to it was a mud-covered rectangular object, half buried and half exposed, an old cassette tape. Its gray plastic case clouded, the label faded. Foley stepped back a few paces, pulled out his phone, and called the Addison County Sheriff's Department. 15 minutes later, the area patrol unit arrived and temporarily sealed off the woods. Addison County Sheriff David Lennox personally came to the scene, along with 2 forensic investigators. They surveyed the area, marked the discovery location, took photographs, and drew a terrain diagram. The rock crevice where the items were found was about 50 meters from the lake shore, obscured by low tree canopies, and easily overlooked when covered by winter snow. A technician wearing gloves picked up the bone fragment and gave a preliminary assessment. Size consistent with an adult or adolescent human humerus or femur. The dark fabric scraps were collected into separate evidence bags, while the cassette tape was placed in a moisture-proof container and sealed on site. While completing the scene report, Lennox recalled a long unsolved missing person case from the same area and ordered the administrative division to pull the old Cedar Hollow files. That afternoon, he contacted the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit to report the discovery as potentially connected to the 1986 disappearance of Rachel Linden. By late afternoon, a team of state forensic technicians was dispatched. They expanded the cordon and searched the surrounding area with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar for additional traces. Within a 10-meter radius of the crevice, they located several more small bone fragments believed to belong to the same individual, but no intact skeletal structure. All evidence was cataloged, bones and fabric pieces were placed in refrigerated containers, while the cassette tape was kept separately in a desiccant bag. The scene report meticulously recorded the time of collection, environmental conditions, GPS coordinates, and the names of collecting officers. By 6 p.m. that day, all evidence was transported by specialized vehicle to the Central Forensic Laboratory in Montpelier. Addison County's initial report was accompanied by an official request for the Vermont State Police to assume the investigation and verify any connection to Case 861204. As the convoy left Maple Ridge, thick fog again began to settle over the water. Emergency lights flickering across the remaining patches of ice. Foley, the hunter, stood several dozen meters away, watching the yellow police tape strung through the trees before quietly walking away, unaware that his discovery that morning would once again make the name buried under the snow of long ago echo through the town of Cedar Hollow after nearly 3 decades of silence. The bone fragments and evidence recovered from Maple Ridge were rushed to the Vermont State Forensic Laboratory that same night. The examination team cleaned, dried, and performed preliminary classification. In the first report, Chief Medical Examiner Elizabeth Crawford clearly stated, bone structure and proportions are consistent with a female aged 15, 18. However, positive identification required genetic comparison. The DNA unit at the Montpelier lab extracted cellular material from samples of the humerus and teeth. The process took over a week due to natural decomposition over many years. Concurrently, Addison County deputies contacted the Linden family, who still lived in Cedar Hollow, informed them of the discovery, and obtained permission to collect a blood sample from Mary Linden, Rachel's mother, for comparison. The sample was drawn on April 12, 2013, and sent directly to Montpelier under seal. In the laboratory, technicians used mitochondrial DNA amplification to compare genetic markers between the bone and maternal blood samples. Analysis was completed on April 16. The report recorded a 99.96% mitochondrial DNA match, confirming direct maternal lineage. Dr. Crawford officially signed, "Identity of remains recovered at Maple Ridge, confirmed as Rachel Linden, missing since December 1986." The news was transmitted by urgent wire to the Addison County Sheriff's Office and then forwarded to the Vermont State Police. When the documents reached Sheriff David Lennox, he read them in silence before immediately drafting a request to reopen Case 861204 under the classification homicide investigation. The following morning, an emergency meeting was held in Montpelier attended by state representatives, forensic staff, and the cold case unit. All evidence related to Rachel Linden's 1986 disappearance was retrieved from state archives, including the original reports, scene photographs, and investigation logs compiled by then-Sheriff Tom Keene. The documents were yellowed, brittle and faded, yet still legible enough to confirm that the original investigation had been suspended due to lack of evidence and absence of a body. Now, with the victim positively identified, the case officially moved from missing person to an unsolved homicide. The state police issued an internal bulletin, reclassification, case hash 861204, Rachel Linden, female, 16 years old, identified deceased. Case transferred to Vermont State Police Cold Case Division. In that moment, a file forgotten for nearly 3 decades was revived, along with every unanswered question it contained. Investigators prepared a supplemental report stating, "Cause of death undetermined." Further analysis required of evidence collected in 1986 and 2013 to clarify mechanism of death. In Cedar Hollow, official notification was delivered to the Linden family on April 18. Local officers personally handed over the brief confirmation document. Remains located in the Maple Ridge area have been identified as those of Rachel Linden, your daughter. There was no media frenzy, no commotion, just a door closing far too late. That same day, copies of the DNA report and bone photographs were forwarded to the cold case unit for inclusion in the new file titled Reopened Investigation, Rachel Linden. The bold heading, Homicide Investigation, was stamped in red on the cover page, marking the legal recharacterization of the case and the beginning of a comprehensive review that no one on the team then imagined would trigger the most complex chain of events in Vermont investigative history. Immediately after the victim's identity was confirmed, the Vermont State Police forensic team continued in-depth analysis of evidence from the Maple Ridge scene, paying particular attention to the length of nylon cord found near the bones. The item was transferred to the state's Advanced Materials Lab in Burlington, which possessed more modern fiber and polymer analysis equipment than was available in 1986. The preliminary report noted, white nylon cord, 4 mm diameter, double twist construction, 6.2% average elasticity, consistent with types commonly sold at farm supply stores in the 1980s. When the new sample was compared spectroscopically with the sealed 1986 cord segment still in storage, infrared analysis showed complete polymer and structural fingerprint matches. Wear patterns and fiber breakage indicated short-duration high-load bearing. Technicians used a scanning electron microscope to examine deformed fiber regions and discovered uniform circular compression marks with opposing tension vectors, characteristic of ligature application. The report also noted the cord showed no environmental oxidation or degradation, indicating it had been buried in mud and leaf litter immediately after use. A small section was cut for modern PCR biological testing. After enzymatic treatment, the team recovered trace human epithelial cells adhering to the twisted fibers, human DNA present but in very low quantity. Mitochondrial analysis showed the DNA did not belong to the victim, but to another individual, most likely the person who applied force to the cord. Friction patterns and organic residue also indicated sweat and natural skin oils, supporting the theory that the cord had been drawn tightly around human skin. Elizabeth Crawford's second report, dated April 22, stated multiple ligature abrasion patterns present on the nylon cord, spacing consistent with the neck circumference of an adolescent. Deformation pattern compatible with elastic ligature strangulation. Experts constructed a force model simulation demonstrating that the observed indentations required tension equivalent to an adult pulling with both hands. In the same report, Crawford added medical findings from recovered cervical vertebrae. C3 and C4 showed small transverse fractures consistent with sudden posterior ligature force. Although exact time of death could not be established due to decomposition, the injury pattern indicated intentional rather than accidental trauma. Conclusions were entered into the Vermont State Police electronic case file with high confidence rating. The nylon cord was reclassified as primary evidence, cause of death link. During an internal cold case division technical briefing, State Forensic Director Dr. Harold Renner presented the results to prosecutors. Cord structure, wear patterns, and biological traces indicate death by ligature consistent with the recovered cord. No evidence of suicide or mechanical accident. The official conclusion was approved on the afternoon of April 24, 2013. Cause of death: asphyxia by ligature strangulation. A copy, along with all optical images, technical reports, and DNA tables, was forwarded to the cold case unit. When retired Sheriff Tom Keene was informed of the new findings, he remained silent for a long time. In his memory, that year's snow had buried every trace. But now the suspicions he once harbored had been scientifically proven. In the final summary, a bold note was added to the front of the file. Cause of death confirmed: homicide by strangulation. This change not only ended nearly 30 years of speculation, but opened an entirely new investigative phase in which every old fact had to be re-examined under the light of modern forensic evidence. The cassette tape recovered alongside the bones and fabric scraps in the Maple Ridge crevice attracted immediate attention, but because of heavy moisture and thick mud coating, restoration required time. In the Vermont State Police Audio Forensics Lab, technicians cleaned the outer casing and slowly dried the tape in a dehumidification chamber for 24 hours before removing the spool. The magnetic ribbon was largely intact, but stuck at several points and required special solvent separation. After 3 days of treatment, the tape was sent to the FBI's Advanced Audio Laboratory at Quantico for recovery and digitization. The extracted recording lasted 11 minutes and 32 seconds. The first 4 minutes contained only wind noise and forest ambient sounds mixed with crunching footsteps on snow. Starting at the 5th minute, the audio changed dramatically: rapid breathing, a young female voice sobbing, "Please don't," followed by a weak, trembling, "I can't breathe." The sound cut in and out, then a calm, low male voice clearly pronounced 3 words, "It's too late." This was followed by a loud impact, possibly against the ground, and then complete silence for the final 5 minutes. When FBI audio engineers analyzed the frequency spectrum, they confirmed the recording showed no signs of editing or voice insertion. Natural resonance characteristics indicated an open, windy outdoor environment consistent with the terrain around the lake. Age-related distortion was present, but voice quality remained sufficient for identification. The Voice Lab used biometric voice print software to compare the recording against archived Vermont interrogation samples from 1980-1990. The database contained a 10-minute 1986 recording of Ethan Rowe speaking with Sheriff Keene, low register, moderate speech rate, distinctive prolonged vowels, and formant frequencies oscillating 82-92 Hz. After 2 days of processing, automated comparison yielded a 96.4% similarity index between the male voice on the tape and Ethan Rowe's sample. The FBI report returned to Montpelier on April 28 stated, "Voice identification. High probability match, Ethan Rowe." Analysts further noted the male voice displayed flat affect and steady breathing, while the female voice exhibited extreme fear, indicating a stark emotional imbalance between the two individuals. These results were presented at an emergency cold case unit meeting the next morning, alongside the nylon cord evidence and forensic conclusions. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford observed, The victim's pleas align temporally with the act of strangulation. The voice match probability permits the conclusion that the man was present at the scene. In the technical transcript, detailed spectrographic analysis noted the female voice in the 220–260 Hz range with increasing tremor, ending abruptly, while the male voice overlapped stably, emphasizing the word "to," demonstrating deliberate control. The FBI technician added, "Wind level and final impact sound indicate the microphone was less than 1 meter from the speakers. The person holding the recorder may be the speaker himself." The cassette became the centerpiece of evidence, marking a turning point in the entire case. Vermont State Police immediately incorporated the FBI report, annotating it, "Evidence a 628. Audio recording contains probable perpetrator voice." The original tape was placed in cold storage, while digitized copies were provided to the cold case unit for further analysis. In a small conference room at Montpelier headquarters, the prosecutor read aloud the key portion, victim Rachel Linden pleading for mercy. Unidentified male voice responds, "It's too late." When the recording was played, the room fell silent except for the faint hiss from the projector. The girl's voice, broken, fragile, mixed with cold wind whistling through the microphone, then the male voice, low, dry, final. No translation was needed. The meaning of those 3 words removed all remaining doubt about the nature of the crime. The Vermont State Police official report issued April 30th concluded, "Audio evidence from the cassette recovered at Maple Ridge demonstrates victim Rachel Linden was alive at the moment of assault. Male voice in recording matches, suspect Ethan Rowe at 96% confidence." With this information entered into the system, the case shifted to active criminal investigation status. With the nylon cord, DNA traces, and now audio evidence, the events of 1986 were gradually reconstructed into a complete picture. In the cold case unit log, the final entry from that meeting was brief but weighty. Voice confirmed, timeline reconstruction authorized. In early May 2013, after the voice identification report was verified and the Rachel Linden case officially reclassified, the Vermont State Police appointed Detective Sarah Miller of the cold case unit as lead investigator. Miller, age 42, had solved numerous long-dormant Vermont cases and was known for meticulous document verification. On her first day with the file, she spent nearly 8 hours reading every original document transferred from Addison County Archives, more than 200 pages of reports, photographs, technical analyses, and witness statements. The paper was yellowed, ink faded, edges frayed, yet she marked key details in red pen. While comparing Sheriff Tom Keene's 1986 report with the state's archived copy, Miller noticed a discrepancy in Ethan Rowe's statement. Page 2 was missing from the original, and the photocopy ended abruptly before describing Rowe's movements on the night of the disappearance. She checked the evidence log and filing index and found a penciled note, "Page damaged, not scanned." However, the physical file showed no tear or damage, only a newer staple replacing the original in the corner, different from the rest of the documents. Miller immediately requested the master original for comparison. When the page arrived, she examined it under light and detected fresh staple impressions, evidence of removal and replacement. At the bottom, Ethan's signature was fainter than normal, and beside it a very faint erasure mark, visible only when tilted. She photographed everything and noted interview transcript of suspect Ethan Rowe, signs of mechanical alteration. Continuing through other documents, Miller discovered 2 Maple Ridge scene reports exhibiting the same tampering handwritten author names had been replaced with typed text, and the report closing times were shifted 3 hours later than recorded in the state system. This raised alarm because Tom Keene was known for obsessive accuracy with timestamps. In the cold case unit internal log, Miller wrote, "Inconsistencies found in 1986 report, possible alteration post-filing." She asked administration to verify when the file was entered into the central Montpelier system and learned the current digital copy had been resubmitted in 1989, 3 years after the case was closed. The discrepancy convinced Miller that someone had interfered with the file during storage. She gathered every document and arranged them chronologically: missing person report, witness statements, search warrants, nylon cord evidence, forensic reports, and finally Keene's signed closure summary. When she pinned the timeline to the wall, she noticed a near-total blank between December 15 and 18, 1986. No investigative activity logged during the critical days immediately after the car was found. In her memo to the Cold Case Unit Director, Miller wrote, "3-day gap in investigative log, highly likely related to document removal or alteration." She decided she would have to interview everyone still alive who had worked the original case. That evening, alone in her small office under desk lamp light, Miller stared at the old file, the black and white photo of the silver sedan in the Maple Ridge Woods, and the blurred photocopy of the altered statement, feeling that something had been deliberately hidden years ago. Before leaving, she typed the final line of the day's report: "Case reopened for document verification. Anomaly detected in primary suspect statement." 3 days after discovering the discrepancies in the original file, Inspector Sarah Miller decided to track down the only person who could explain the gaps in the documentation: retired Police Chief Tom Keene. He had retired in 1998 and was living with his wife in the town of Middlebury, about 40 miles from Cedar Hollow. On an early May afternoon, Miller drove to the small log house on the shore of Lake Champlain, where Keene usually spent the spring. When she introduced herself as being from the Cold Case Unit and mentioned the Rachel Linden case, he was silent for a few seconds before inviting her inside. The living room was simple. On the wall hung a photo of Keene with the Cedar Hollow police team from the 1980s. Everyone still looking young. He poured coffee, sat down across from Miller, his hands still habitually clasping together before he spoke. When Miller explained that pages of testimony were missing from the original file, and there were signs of alteration, Keene looked down at the table, nodded slightly, his eyes weary. "I know about that," he said slowly. "In 1986, after the search ended, I was called to the Addison County Prosecutor's office. They told me the case should be shelved. No body, no solid evidence, and the Rowe boy was the son of the county's legal advisor." Miller took notes on every word and asked if he had received any specific orders. Keene sighed. "No one gave a direct order, but I got the message. They didn't want a murky case dragging on and damaging the county's reputation. I objected, but in the end I had to sign off on closing the file. I kept a full copy, including Ethan's second statement, in which he described a different route from the official one." Miller asked to see the copy. Keene nodded, stood up, and went into a small study. A few minutes later he returned with an old, faded, worn leather-bound notebook. He placed it on the table and opened it to a page marked with a folded piece of paper. It was his handwritten record from 1986, detailing the scene and his personal observations. "I never submitted this notebook to the file because it was personal notes," he said. On the third page, Miller read the scrawled line: "Circular indentation on birch trunk approx. 30 m from lake edge, height 1.67 m. White frayed fibers." Next to it was a simple hand-drawn diagram marking the discovery location. Keene explained that at the time, he had suspected strangulation because the shape of the mark matched the force of a pulled rope. He had requested photos, but the film roll was later reported as ruined by moisture. Miller asked why he hadn't recorded it in the official report. Keene looked out the window, his voice lowering. "I intended to, but the next morning an order came from above to stop the investigation and turn in the file. I chose silence because I knew, if I pushed, I'd be transferred. I thought about it for years." He handed Miller the notebook, saying she could take it to make copies as long as it wasn't lost. She accepted it, feeling the notebook was heavier than it looked. As she gathered her things, Keene added, almost like a belated confession, "I suspected Ethan from the start, but when his father intervened, I knew this case would never go anywhere. I kept these notes in case someone someday came looking for the truth." When Miller left the house, the Vermont sky was covered in gray clouds, a cold wind blowing off the lake, lightly rustling the note she had clipped inside the notebook. On Keene's shaky handwriting, rope mark on tree, facing the lake. She realized it wasn't just a scene description, it was the missing link between the past and the newly reopened file. She drove back to Montpelier in silence, already reorganizing the next steps in her mind. Verify the location recorded in the notebook, cross-reference it with the scene map, and if the mark was still there, it would be the key to reconstructing the entire sequence of events buried for nearly 3 decades. On the morning of May 9, 2013, just 3 days after receiving Tom Keene's notebook, Inspector Sarah Miller and the Vermont State Forensic Team returned to the Maple Ridge Forest. The air was damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth. The canopy was filling with new spring leaves, and light filtering through the gaps created a faint mist hanging between the trees. She brought copies of Keene's notes, which included a sketch of the rope mark on a birch trunk 30 meters southwest of the lake edge. The 3-person technical team used GPS devices, comparing the old coordinates with current topographic maps to pinpoint the search area. When they reached the marked spot, the ground was still damp and covered with a thin layer of moss. A few old trees leaned from the previous year's storms. One technician pointed to the trunk of a large tree near the slope. On the silvery bark was a thin, darker scar ring, about 1.6 meters high, almost perfectly matching the notebook description. Miller stepped closer, confirmed the height with a tape measure, then carefully examined the surface texture. The scar was not caused by insects or fungus. It was an arc-shaped indentation. The wood beneath the hard bark depressed, with smooth edges, indicating prolonged mechanical circular pressure. She ordered the forensic team to set up a work area, string yellow tape, and erect a portable canopy to prevent contamination. Under a handheld magnifying glass, the technician noticed several opaque white fibers, 2 to 3 millimeters long, embedded deep in the wood along the scar's edge. Using medical tweezers, they removed 3 samples, placed them in sterile glass vials, and sealed them as a 629. Next, a section of wood around the depression was cut out and preserved for age analysis and to determine when the scar formed. When the sample was cut, the smell of dry wood mixed with mildew filled the temporary tent, making the air thick. Miller watched every step, her eyes fixed on the tree, feeling as if she were facing a silent witness from the past. By noon, the entire sampling process was complete. The area was photographed from multiple angles, with detailed notes on coordinates, light direction, and tree angle. The wood and fiber samples were immediately transported to the Montpelier lab in a specialized vehicle. 4 days later, the results came back. The fibers recovered from the tree perfectly matched the polymer structure, diameter, and twist pattern of the 1986 nylon rope evidence, and the rope sample collected at the scene in 2013. DNA analysis on the fiber surface revealed trace biological material with mitochondrial DNA matching victim, Rachel Linden, with a 99.87% probability. The report stated clearly, the nylon fibers on the tree originated from the same type of material as the rope associated with the case, had direct contact with human skin or tissue, estimated time of deposition over 25 years ago. When Miller finished reading, she sat in silence for a long time. In her career, she had seen many old cases broken by DNA, but rarely had evidence survived on a living tree for nearly 3 decades. She wrote in her work log, "The scar is still there, the evidence is still there, only people change." The report was immediately added to the file, along with scene photos and the technician's notes. Indentation at 1.67 m height, north-facing width 3.8 centimeters, consistent with nylon rope diameter. Likely fixed point during strangulation. At the bottom of the page, Miller added the order, preliminary conclusion. The birch scar at Maple Ridge matches the 1986 description, proving rope use at the scene, direct link to the victim. That same afternoon, she returned to Maple Ridge for one final personal check. Sunlight slanted through the forest, reflecting off the pale brown scar, and when she lightly touched the wood surface, a rough, cold sensation spread across her palm. Everything Keene had written in his notebook was now scientifically verified. That rope mark really existed, still intact after all those years, and it had silently preserved evidence of a murder buried under Vermont snow. The completed forensic report, combining the DNA results and the Maple Ridge evidence, was forwarded to the Vermont State Forensic Lab to reconstruct the full sequence of events from the night of December 1986. Inspector Sarah Miller attended the reconstruction presentation with scene experts, forensic biologists, and the geometric modeling team. In the Montpelier research room, they used old topographic data, combined with 1986 scene photos and the newly collected samples, to create a three-dimensional model. The reconstruction showed Rachel and Ethan leaving the Wendy's around 10 p.m., driving west in the silver sedan toward Maple Ridge Lake. At that time, the temperature was below -10 degrees Celsius, snow was falling heavily, visibility under 30 meters. Based on Ethan's original statement and the new rope location data, the team determined they stopped on a northern trail, more than 200 meters from the lake. The abrasion on the birch trunk showed the rope had been pulled from behind toward the lake, meaning the victim was strangled while standing or forced to the ground. Mud samples on the suspect's shoes and soil from the 1986 lake edge matched the clay-heavy soil near the water, supporting the theory that the struggle occurred very close to the shoreline. The forensic experts recreated the sequence using life-size mannequins scaled to Rachel's and Ethan's heights. Based on pull force and fiber wear, the act lasted less than a minute, indicating intent in the use of the rope from behind. From the remaining fiber fragments and fractures on the C3 vertebra, the team concluded the victim lost consciousness almost instantly. Afterward, the perpetrator most likely dragged the body down the slope, about 50 meters from the rope mark, to an area with recorded ground subsidence noted in the 2013 survey. From there, the body was pushed into a natural rock crevice approximately 2 meters deep, where Hunter Richard Foley later found the bones. Fabric fragments matching Rachel's jacket showed the body was intact when hidden, later decomposing naturally due to water seepage and freezing temperatures. The reconstructed audio from the cassette tape was synced with the timeline, matching the moment of strangulation, the plea for help occurring at the same frequency as rapid breathing, followed by wind and a heavy impact, proving the tape recorded the attack in real time. When all data was integrated into the graphic simulation, the image was clear, two figures facing each other in the snow, arguing, the female voice retreating, the male voice advancing, the rope looping around the neck, then everything falling silent. The report concluded, cause of death, asphyxia by ligature strangulation. Sequence consistent with premeditated murder, followed by body concealment in a natural crevice beside the lake. Heavy snow and subsequent ice erased all surface traces, making the scene undetectable during the initial search. When Miller reached the end of the report, she paused for a long time. On the simulation screen, artificial snow still swirled around the two faint figures, turning white and vanishing. Every trace, footprints, drag marks, even breath, had been covered by snow within hours, just as Vermont had kept this secret for nearly 30 years. Miller signed the forensic acceptance form and wrote her final work log entry. Sequence reconstructed argument, strangulation, body disposal. Weather and heavy snow erased all traces on the night of December 12, 1986. After the scene reconstruction report was finalized, the Vermont State Police requested the State Investigation Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit to build a psychological profile of the suspect based on all newly collected data. Inspector Sarah Miller forwarded the team all documents related to Ethan Rowe. The 1986 statements, Chief Keene's notes, witness descriptions, and the voice identification results. The 30-page behavioral report, authored by criminal psychologist Dr. Alan Greer, was presented at the Cold Case Unit meeting on May 20, 2013. The introduction stated, Ethan Rowe, male, born 1968, age 18 at the time of the incident. Average academic record, no prior convictions, but signs of emotional control disorder and possessive tendencies in personal relationships. From statements by former classmates and Wendy's co-workers, the team noted Ethan was usually withdrawn and quiet, but once close to someone, displayed extreme concern, stalking, and control over the other person's behavior. One re-interviewed former classmate said, "If anyone got close to Rachel, he'd get upset. I once heard Ethan tell her she shouldn't work late, like he had the right to decide." The report classified this as obsessive-possessive behavior prone to escalate into violence when control was threatened. From the cassette tape voice data, forensic linguists determined the male voice showed high emotional flatness, no fluctuation, even when the other party was in panic. This matched the profile of a narcissistic controlling individual who displays emotional indifference while harming others. Dr. Greer noted, the phrase "it's too late" reflects absolute decisiveness with no room for negotiation, indicating the subject acted with clear awareness. When cross-referenced with physical evidence, rope strangulation, body location, and concealment timing, the experts concluded the behavior occurred in 3 phases: conflict eruption, active violence, and post-act concealment. No signs of self-defense or accident. Regarding motive, the profile determined Ethan felt threatened when Rachel wanted to end contact after that night shift. Her refusal to go with him, or intent to leave the car, triggered an extreme possessive reaction. In a state of emotional loss of control but full cognitive awareness, he used a nylon rope already in the car to subdue and strangle her. The final recorded words reflected a delusional belief that the act was predetermined and irreversible, characteristic of premeditated murder driven by absolute control. The report further analyzed the power dynamic. Rachel was outgoing and independent, often de-escalating conflict, while Ethan was isolating and emotionally dependent on his object of interest. This contrast created ongoing tension that finally exploded in the confined space of the car on a winter night. Additionally, old-school medical records showed Ethan had received short-term counseling for anger outbursts, but treatment was not continued. Dr. Greer concluded, the behavioral pattern shows the subject was capable of planning, preparing tools, choosing an isolated location, and processing the scene afterward. No evidence of unconscious impulse. In the summary sent to the Vermont State Police, he wrote, possessive personality, ability to maintain emotional control while committing the act, and subsequent body concealment confirm premeditated murder with personal possessive motive. Sarah Miller read the entire report in silence. The psychological descriptions perfectly matched her impression of Ethan from the old files, a terrifyingly calm person who knew exactly what he was doing, but continued because he believed the victim belonged to him. In her work log, she wrote a single sentence: behavioral profile complete, premeditated, controlled, possessive. Ethan Rowe did not lose control, he chose. At the end of May 2013, after the behavioral profile was finalized and the forensic results had closed the chain of evidence, Inspector Sarah Miller and the Cold Case Unit officially compiled all documents for submission to the Vermont Attorney General's office. In her Montpelier office, she arranged every file folder in chronological order: 1986 scene reports, 2013 DNA reports, FBI voice identification, Caldwell's supply rope purchase receipt, Ethan Rowe's original statements, and additional forensic documents. Everything was bound in thick hard covers labeled Case 861204, Comprehensive Evidence Summary. Each item was numbered, with source, collection date, and verifying agency clearly noted. At the front, Miller listed Exhibit A 623 nylon rope section recovered at Maple Ridge. A 624 Caldwell's supply purchase receipt, signed E. Rowe. A 625 nylon rope coil seized from suspect's residence, matching polymer structure. A 628 cassette tape containing victim's pleas and unidentified male voice. FBI voice lab result, 96.4% match to Ethan Rowe. A 629 nylon fibers on tree, confirmed, victim DNA. The final section included the 1986 statements with former Chief Tom Keene's notes, confirming the discrepancy between Ethan's described route and the actual scene location. Alan Greer's behavioral report was attached, concluding premeditated act, possessive motive, tool preparation, and isolated location selection. The nearly 300-page file was personally delivered by Miller to Chief State Prosecutor Michael Torrens, who reviewed it in a closed-door meeting with the legal team. After almost 3 hours of examination, Torrens concluded, "All elements constituting second-degree murder are present. We have physical, biological, audio, indirect witness, and premeditation evidence." That same afternoon, he signed the request for the Rutland court to issue an arrest warrant for Ethan Rowe. The legal basis section read, "Based on verified scientific evidence and behavioral analysis, suspect Ethan Rowe is charged with the premeditated murder of Rachel Linden, committed in December 1986 at Maple Ridge, Addison County." The warrant was urgently transmitted through the federal system for nationwide validity. When Miller held the certified copy with the red seal, she looked at the number 861204 printed in the top corner, the case number that had followed her for months, the same number that had sat in a dusty metal cabinet for nearly 3 decades. That afternoon, the Vermont State Police held the final meeting before execution. On the board, Miller presented the chain of evidence in a linear diagram from the rope purchase receipt, DNA evidence, cassette tape, statements, and psychological profile, all connecting into an unbroken timeline. At the end, she said simply, "Every piece of data, evidence, and statement points to one person, Ethan Rowe." No one objected. The investigation unit chief nodded, confirming coordination with the FBI field office in Bangor, Maine, Ethan's current residence according to records. The encrypted warrant was transmitted at 5:40 p.m. that day. Miller signed the transfer protocol and wrote her final work log entry. Evidence consolidated, arrest warrant approved. The 30-year circle is closed. As she left the Montpelier building, a light spring rain began to fall, tiny droplets collecting on the thick file in her hand. Amid the steady sound of rain and passing traffic, she clearly felt that those pages were no longer old documents. They had become the final testimony dragging the past back into the present, forcing one man to face the crime he once believed was forever buried beneath the Vermont snow of 1986. On the morning of June 2, 2013, the arrest warrant for Ethan Rowe was executed in Bangor, Maine, where he worked as a mechanic at a small truck repair shop on the outskirts of the city. The operation was carried out by the Vermont State Police in coordination with the FBI's New England field office under the direct command of Inspector Sarah Miller. According to tax records and residency data, Ethan rented a ground-floor apartment in an old wooden complex on Mill Street, lived alone, and rarely spoke to neighbors. A 7-member FBI tactical team and 2 Vermont officers arrived before dawn, taking up 3 positions surrounding the building. At 6:20 a.m., as Ethan stepped out of the apartment wearing a green jacket and a knit cap, an agent blocked the walkway, identified himself, and read the warrant. Ethan stopped, looked around, his face expressionless. After a few seconds of silence, he slowly raised his hands without resistance. 2 sets of figure-8 cuffs clicked shut, the faint metallic sound ringing in the cold air. The rest of the team immediately began searching the residence under the accompanying warrant, recording the entire process on video. The small room was cluttered but clean, smelling of motor oil mixed with cigarette smoke. On the wooden table beside the bed sat an old tin box, lid closed but unlocked. When opened, it contained a neatly coiled, frayed white nylon cord and several faded old photographs. One of them showed Rachel Linden wearing a green jacket, smiling in front of a Wendy's, the paper yellowed at the edges. Police immediately sealed the entire box, labeled it as new evidence, A630. They also seized a small notebook filled mostly with work notes, but on the last page was scrawled handwriting. "It's too late, 1986. The handwriting sample was photographed and sent for analysis. While searching the closet, technicians found another short length of the same type of nylon cord as the old evidence, partially cut and hidden inside a toolbox. All items were packaged in sealed evidence bags and loaded into the transport van. While the tech team worked, Ethan sat motionless on a wooden chair in the living room, eyes fixed on the floor, saying nothing. An agent reread him his Miranda rights. He simply nodded and said in a low voice, "I understand." When Miller entered carrying the case file, she stood a few feet away, opened her briefcase, pulled out a copy of the arrest warrant, and read each line aloud. Ethan looked up, his gaze blank, as if listening to a story from very far away. She asked if he wanted an attorney present. He answered quietly, "No need. I know why you're here." The reply was short, cold, delivered in an even tone. The arrest concluded at 7:05 a.m. with no resistance. Ethan was escorted outside as a light rain began to fall, mist rising from the wet pavement. Local reporters had not yet arrived. The matter was kept confidential until he was safely extradited to Vermont. The convoy drove for 4 hours, arriving at Vermont State Police headquarters in Montpelier in the early afternoon. The scene report was completed immediately. Suspect Ethan Rowe, male, 45 years old, arrested in Bangor, Maine, pursuant to warrant No. 861204VT. No resistance. Evidence seized includes tin box containing nylon cord and photograph of victim Rachel Linden. When Miller signed the transfer receipt, she lingered for a moment in the temporary interview room, looking through the frosted glass at Ethan sitting alone, hands cuffed, posture straight, eyes neither evasive nor defiant. She opened the case file, her fingers pausing on the receipt for the cord purchase, then on the photograph of the scar on the birch tree at Maple Ridge. Every detail connected: the cord, the voice, the cassette tape, the DNA, the old statements, and now the man himself, still carrying that same calm gaze from years ago. She tapped her fingers lightly on the table and signed the final line of the report. Arrest completed. Suspect Ethan Rowe safely extradited to Vermont. Seized evidence consistent with 1986 case file. As the interrogation room door closed, rain pounded steadily on the tin roof outside, and in that moment, Miller knew the nearly 30-year journey had finally returned to where it began. In the cold, rainy season of northern New England, with a quiet man in an old tin box holding a worn white cord, evidence that never spoke yet, could never be buried forever. Ethan Rowe's interrogation took place the same day, June 2, 2013, at Vermont State Police headquarters in Montpelier, in a standard interview room equipped with surveillance cameras. Inspector Sarah Miller led the session alongside prosecutor Michael Torrens and 2 forensic investigators. Ethan sat across from them, hands still cuffed in front, eyes dull, voice low and flat. When Miller began with the routine question about his relationship with Rachel Linden, Ethan answered slowly that they were just classmates who sometimes carpooled after work. She asked about the evening of December 12, 1986. He said, "I dropped her off at Miller's Corner. Rachel wanted to walk the rest of the way home. I turned around. That was it." His tone was even, emotionless. Miller placed a copy of the nylon cord purchase receipt on the table and asked why he bought the cord 2 days before the disappearance. Ethan paused for several seconds, then said he had been doing side work at the shop and needed cord to tie down loads, completely unrelated. She showed no reaction. Simply opened the second folder and slid out a photograph of the silver car, abandoned in Maple Ridge, pointing to the corner. "This your car?" He nodded. "Why was it there?" "I got stuck in the snow. The car slid off into the woods and wouldn't start again." Miller took notes, then produced the nylon cord forensic report and DNA results. Ethan glanced at them briefly, his shoulders trembling slightly, but he maintained his calm demeanor. When she started the tape player and pressed play, the hiss of the old cassette filled the room, followed by a panicked female voice, frantic breathing, and then a decisive male voice. "It's too late." Ethan lowered his head slightly, hands clenching on the table until his knuckles turned white, but he said nothing. When the recording ended, the room fell silent. Miller asked directly, "Is that your voice on the tape?" A long pause, only the hum of the camera. Then he said hoarsely, "I don't remember. It's been too long." She stared at him. "The FBI says it's a 96.4% voice print match. Do you deny it?" He was quiet, then whispered, "If they say so, it's probably right." Torrens made a note and signaled to continue. Miller asked about the night at Maple Ridge. Ethan began repeating his story, but this time added that Rachel wanted to end everything, that she said she couldn't take the pressure anymore and wanted to hurt herself. He claimed he tried to stop her, but everything happened too fast. This version completely contradicted his 1986 statement that she wanted to walk home. When Miller pointed out the discrepancy, he hesitated. "He was afraid if I told the truth, they'd think I killed her," she asked. "Did you know the nylon cord was used to strangle her?" He looked down at the table, voice low. "I didn't mean to do it. She grabbed the cord then slipped. I tried to pull her back." The sentence trailed off, his throat catching, but no tears came. When the prosecutor showed photographs of the cord marks on the tree, Ethan looked up, lips pressed tight. "You know this place. I remember a birch tree by the lake. And that's where Rachel died, maybe." Miller leaned forward and pressed. "You pulled the cord, didn't you?" After a pause, he answered, "I didn't mean for her to die." It was half confession, but enough to close the debate. After nearly 3 hours, Ethan admitted he was at Maple Ridge with Rachel the night she disappeared, that he had the cord in his hands, and that he pulled too hard while trying to stop her from leaving. When asked why he hid the body, he said, "I panicked. The snow was heavy. I didn't know what to do." The entire statement was audio and video recorded. After the transcript was read back to him, he signed the last page, his signature slightly shaky but legible. Prosecutor Torrens confirmed. Suspect Ethan Rowe admits to the act that caused Rachel Linden's death, claims it was accidental with no intent to kill, yet does not deny the voice on the tape is his. The report was stamped and co-signed by the 2 investigators. As Miller gathered her papers, Ethan sat motionless, staring at the floor. She paused at the door and asked, "All these years, did you ever think this day would come?" He didn't answer, only sighed, eyes fixed on the white wall where the camera reflected pale yellow light. After the session, the full recording was duplicated and sent directly to the Vermont prosecutor's office, along with the signed transcript. Miller walked out, down the long hallway, the old cassette tape still in her file folder. The faint hiss, and that low male voice, half confessing after 30 years, still echoed in her head. A voice once buried by Vermont snow now ringing clear in the summer of 2013, closing 3 decades of silence with a single sentence, "It's too late." 3 days after the interrogation, the complete Rachel Linden case file was finalized and formally transferred to the Rutland County District Attorney's Office for prosecution review. The file exceeded 500 pages and included the signed interrogation transcript, audio recording of the confession, forensic evidence reports, DNA analysis, the FBI voice analysis, the nylon cord purchase receipt, and all reinvestigation material from the cold case unit. On the morning of June 5, 2013, Rutland County District Attorney Karen Whitford chaired a meeting with the legal team and Vermont State Police representatives. Each item was presented in order: physical evidence, statements, lab results, and cross-references. Whitford listened, taking notes, then requested the key segment of the cassette tape be played again, the portion where Rachel pleads and the male voice says, "It's too late." When the sound ended, she closed the file, looked around the table, and said, "We have everything we need to prosecute." The charging memorandum was drafted that same afternoon, specifying the counts second-degree murder and tampering with concealing evidence. The reasoning was explicit. Defendant Ethan Rowe intentionally performed the act that caused Rachel Linden's death by using nylon cord to strangle the victim, thereafter concealing the body to cover up the crime. The act is deemed intentional and premeditated to a degree, but without long-term planning, thus falling under second-degree murder per Vermont criminal statute. Cold case unit investigators were summoned to verify chain of events and signature. Inspector Sarah Miller summarized, "We have proven an unbroken evidentiary chain, the nylon cord, DNA, tree marks, voice analysis, and the suspect's statement all align in time, location, and method." Dr. Alan Greer's psychological profile was attached as supplementary evidence to establish controlling possessive motive, an aggravating factor in determining degree. After final review, Whitford signed the indictment and sent it directly to Rutland County Superior Court. The charging document contained a concise yet complete summary. Ethan Rowe, male, age 45, is charged with second-degree murder and tampering with concealing evidence in connection with the death of Rachel Linden on December 12, 1986. In the Maple Ridge area of Addison County, Vermont, physical, biological, and audio evidence prove intentional acts resulting in the victim's death, as well as concealment of the remains. The court immediately issued notice of acceptance and scheduled preliminary hearing. When the confirmation returned to Vermont State Police, Miller read the charging decision with a mixture of relief and heaviness. Nearly 30 years, hundreds of report pages, scraps of cord, tape, and Keene's old notebook had finally become legal grounds binding a man to his own guilt. At day's end, in the cold case unit office, Miller completed the final transfer report and signed Case Hash 861204, reclassified as homicide. Prosecutor's indictment approved. A new label was affixed to the red folder, State of Vermont vs. Ethan Rowe. As she closed the file, she stood and looked out the window at the late afternoon light falling on the headquarters roof, feeling clearly that what once were only theories in the snow had now become legal fact. On the last page of her duty log, she wrote, "File delivered to prosecutor, charges established as second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. 30 years, a reasonable ending, but not yet the final one." On September 16, 2013, Rutland County Superior Court formally opened the trial of Ethan Rowe, charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence in the death of Rachel Linden. The courtroom was more crowded than expected. The public gallery was packed with Cedar Hollow residents, local reporters, and people who had joined the 1986 search. Ethan was brought in that morning, wearing a pale dress shirt, face gaunt, eyes calm and expressionless, as the clerk read the indictment aloud. At the prosecution table, Karen Whitford's team laid out every piece of evidence, each sealed envelope numbered, and presented to the jury. Judge Robert Haynes presided, instructing both sides to stay within procedural bounds. In her opening, the prosecution summarized scientific and testimonial evidence shows Rachel Linden was killed on the night of December 12, 1986, at Maple Ridge. The act was committed using nylon cord purchased by the defendant 2 days earlier. The defendant concealed the body and fled the scene. Whitford placed each item on the evidence table, the nylon cord segment, matching the victim's DNA, the purchase receipt, signed E. Rowe, DNA report, FBI voice analysis, and the 2013 recovered cassette tape. The courtroom fell completely silent when prosecution played the fully restored recording for the jury. The faint hiss sounded, then a trembling female voice, "Please don't," followed by gasping breaths, and the low, cold male voice, "It's too late." Several spectators lowered their heads. Rachel's elderly mother raised a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. The judge called a brief recess to compose the room. When the tape ended, Whitford stated clearly, "The FBI has determined that male voice matches Ethan Rowe's 1986 interview voice print at 96.4%. She displayed the frequency chart showing the near-identical waveforms. Defense attorney Daniel Kerr moved to exclude the audio evidence, arguing lack of integrity due to age and environmental exposure, but the court denied the motion. Whitford moved to physical exhibits, nylon cord samples, photographs of the scarred birch at Maple Ridge, and the forensic report concluding death by asphyxia due to ligature strangulation. Forensic pathologist Elizabeth Crawford testified, describing the examination. Fractures in the hyoid bone and DNA on the cord prove strangulation. No evidence of suicide. She showed enlarged microscopic images to the jury, pointing out abrasion patterns from pulling force. Defense attempted to argue that the incomplete remains prevent definitive conclusion on manner of death, but Crawford replied firmly, "The marks could only result from intentional force, not accident." Prosecution next presented the Caldwell's supply receipt. Store owner Arthur Caldwell testified in person that the purchaser was Ethan Rowe, recalling, He asked me which cord was strongest and wouldn't stretch under heavy pull. The jury took notes in silence. The prosecution then displayed old crime scene photos, the snow-covered silver sedan, route maps, and the birch tree with the scar, where the decayed cord containing Rachel's DNA was recovered. Whitford concluded, "This is an unbroken chain cord, scene, DNA, audio, confession." During cross-examination, Ethan took the stand. His voice was soft and hoarse, eyes red and downcast more often than not. To the prosecutor's questions he said, "I didn't mean to kill her. We argued, she tried to leave. I held her back, she fell, the cord tightened." Whitford asked, "Do you recognize your own voice on the tape?" "Maybe," he answered, "but I don't remember clearly. You said it's too late." "What did you mean?" "I don't know. I was panicking." The courtroom remained silent. Defense requested a recess for the defendant's emotional state, but the judge ordered continuation. Miller, seated at the back as an investigative witness, watched Ethan's face, cold and distant. When prosecution rested, they reiterated the key points: possessive motive, preparation, unbroken evidence chain. There is no longer any doubt that Rachel Linden was deprived of her life by the man seated before you, Whitford said, voice steady but sharp. Defense could only weakly argue the incident was an accident during mental distress, but when prosecution countered with the cord purchased 2 days prior, that argument collapsed. Late in the afternoon, the court adjourned. In the long hallway, footsteps echoed on the old stone floor, yellow light falling on tired faces. The cassette tape was resealed in its envelope and returned to the evidence table, still the small central object containing the entire sound of guilt. The clerk's notes for day 1 closed with jury heard all physical and audio evidence. Trial to continue tomorrow for closing arguments. In her personal journal, Sarah Miller wrote, "After nearly 30 years, that voice sounded again, this time not in the snow, but in a courtroom where silence can no longer hide anything." On the second day of the trial, the Rutland courtroom was even more packed than the day before, with tension hanging heavy from the morning. The defense opened their argument by claiming Rachel Linden's death was an accident in extreme weather conditions, with no intent to kill. Attorney Daniel Kerr stood before the jury, his voice striving to remain calm, stating that the blizzard on the night of December 12, 1986, reduced visibility and made the ground slippery, causing a nylon cord to tighten around the victim's neck in an uncontrolled situation. He insisted Ethan Rowe was only trying to hold Rachel back as she attempted to walk away in the snow, and that the accident happened in a chaotic, unforeseeable moment. Kerr presented simulated images showing the steep, thickly iced terrain of Maple Ridge, arguing that if Rachel fell and the cord wrapped around her neck, natural pulling force could cause asphyxiation. Part of the gallery murmured, but prosecutor Whitford immediately objected, calling the argument absurd and unscientific. The judge allowed it to continue, instructing the prosecution to rebut after the forensic witness was called. Elizabeth Crawford took the stand, holding her autopsy report folder, her voice calm but firm. She began with a clear statement: "There is no evidence whatsoever of an accident." She then displayed close-up images of the ligature marks on the nylon cord and force simulations. Pointing to the screen, she said, "This is the contact area. The marks are round even with uniform compression around the neck that only happens with active pulling force, not from falling or snagging." When Kerr asked whether the cord could have wrapped due to wind or gravity, she replied curtly, "No." The cord structure and twist direction show the person controlling the cord stood behind the victim and pulled continuously until breathing stopped. There are no signs of impact or sliding fall. She went on to point out small scratches on the collarbone and wrists, defensive wounds. These marks were made by fingernails digging into skin while the victim tried to remove the ligature. That reflex does not exist in an accident. Kerr tried to redirect, asking whether weather and ice could have erased initial evidence and led to mistaken conclusions, but Crawford maintained her steady tone. "Snow can erase footprints, but it cannot alter the shape of bone and tissue injury. Those injuries are recorded in every vertebra. The jury listened intently as she described in detail the strangulation process, the time until loss of consciousness, the asphyxiation cycle, and the uneven pulling force on both sides of the neck, reflecting the perpetrator's position. Her scientific presentation left the courtroom in complete silence. When she finished, Whitford stepped forward, pointing at the image of the nylon cord. If this was an accident, why did the defendant buy the cord 2 days earlier? Why was the victim's DNA on the cord and on the tree trunk at a height matching hers? Kerr remained silent, avoiding the prosecutor's gaze. Whitford continued, if it was an accident, why was the body hidden in a rock crevice? Nobody hides an accident. People only hide guilt. The words rang out decisively through the room. One juror bowed their head to take notes. Ethan sat motionless, eyes sunken, showing no reaction. His lawyer could only fall back on the psychological disturbance argument, but the prosecution countered with Dr. Alan Greer's behavioral report, proving Ethan was lucid, capable of controlling his actions, and had prepared the cord ready before meeting Rachel. The debate dragged into early afternoon, when the judge called a recess for the jury to consider the arguments. Before stepping down, Dr. Crawford added one short sentence: that girl's death was not caused by snow. It was caused by a hand. The statement brought absolute silence to the courtroom. In the hallway, Sarah Miller leaned against the wall, quietly listening to the murmurs inside. She knew that from that moment, the accident in the snow story had lost all weight. The scientific evidence had shattered every layer of pretense, and the truth, cold as the Vermont winter of that year, now stood clear before the jury. The nylon cord did not slip, it was pulled, and Rachel Linden did not fall. She was murdered. On the afternoon of September 20th, 2013, after 4 days of trial and nearly 8 hours of deliberation, the Rutland County Superior Court jury returned to a courtroom thick with tension. Everyone rose as Judge Robert Haynes entered and gavels 3 times to resume the session. The 12 jurors sat in a row. Foreperson Marjorie Klein held the sealed verdict form. The judge directed the clerk to receive and read the result. The soft sound of the envelope opening echoed, then the clerk's steady voice rang out, "We, the jury, having considered all the evidence and testimony, unanimously find the defendant Ethan Rowe guilty of second-degree murder." The room exploded into absolute silence. A few people exhaled softly. Rachel's elderly mother collapsed into her seat, tears streaming quietly. The judge nodded confirmation and asked the clerk to continue with sentencing. Under the state of Vermont sentencing guidelines for second-degree murder, the court sentences defendant Ethan Rowe to 25 years in state prison with no parole eligibility for the first 15 years. Ethan sat motionless, eyes fixed on empty space ahead. When the judge asked if he wished to make a final statement, he only shook his head slightly, voice barely audible. Nothing to say. Haynes read the formal judgment in an even, grave tone. Pursuant to current criminal statutes, the Rutland County Superior Court holds Ethan Rowe criminally responsible for the murder of 16-year-old Rachel Linden on December 12, 1986, at Maple Ridge, Vermont. This 27-year cold case was solved through advances in forensic science and interagency cooperation. When the gavel fell, Miller, seated in the witness row, lowered her head, feeling the air around her freeze. All the fragments of the old file, the cord, the scar on the tree, the tape, the receipt, and Keene's trembling handwritten notes, had finally closed into an official conviction. Whitford glanced at Miller and gave a small nod, one that carried 3 decades of patience and persistence. Ethan was handcuffed. 2 deputies escorted him out. As he passed the gallery, he glanced briefly at the public, expressionless, lips pressed together. The clank of chains echoed sharply down the marble hallway and faded. The judge made his final note, Case 861204, closed, solved after 27 years. The judgment was immediately entered into the Vermont State Archives, marking the longest-standing case in Rutland County history, solved through DNA and voice evidence. On the clerk's desk, the bold red stamp read, Case solved after 27 years, ending 3 decades of silence at Maple Ridge. As the courtroom emptied, Miller lingered, looking at the empty benches while autumn wind whispered through the high windows, swirling scraps of notepaper. She stepped into the hallway, where late daylight fell across the stone floor and fading footprints. And in that moment she knew everything had reached its proper end. Justice, though late, had arrived, and Rachel Linden's name was finally removed from the missing circumstances unknown list and returned to the truth. On October 30th, 2013, almost 6 weeks after the verdict, the Vermont State Police released the final investigative report titled Cold Case 2013, The Rachel Linden Investigation. The 150-plus page document, compiled by the Cold Case Unit and the State Medical Examiner's Office, detailed the entire timeline from the 1986 disappearance to the case being cracked almost 30 years later. The introduction stated clearly, the Rachel Linden case represents an initial investigative failure due to technological limitations and administrative pressure, while simultaneously demonstrating the fundamental shift in modern forensic capability. The report was divided into two main sections: Errors and Limitations of 1986 and Investigative and Forensic Advances, 2013. The first section listed numerous weaknesses in the original process: improper evidence storage, the loss of a critical witness statement page, altered scene reports after archiving, and lack of coordination between Cedar Hollow Police and the Addison County Prosecutor's Office. One note specified, Chief Tom Keene faced pressure from the local prosecutor's office to close the file early. That decision prevented timely examination of key evidence, especially the ligature marks in the scene film. However, the report also concluded there was no evidence of intentional cover-up, only a combination of technical limitations and human factors. In the technical analysis section, experts listed the differences between the two eras. In 1986, DNA technology did not exist in routine casework, and fiber analysis was limited to visual comparison. By 2013, the Vermont lab used mitochondrial DNA amplification and FTIR spectroscopy to achieve exact matches between the cord and the victim. The report also covered the restoration of the cassette tape, the case's turning point. The FBI audio team described multi-layer magnetic recovery and voice matching using Voice ID 9.2 software, identifying Ethan Rowe's voice with over 96% certainty. It was the first time in Vermont history that audio identification served as primary evidence in a criminal trial. The second part outlined the advances that cracked the case: federalized evidence handling protocols, statewide DNA storage standards, 3D crime scene reconstruction software, and the 2009 creation of the dedicated cold case squad. The report highlighted Detective Sarah Miller's role in detecting document discrepancies, locating former Chief Keene's personal notebook, and recovering the cord scar on the tree, the critical link between the old scene and new evidence. The conclusion stated, without the persistence of the cold case unit and forensic progress, Rachel Linden's case might have remained forever among the missing. DNA evidence, voice analysis, and 3D reconstruction re-established the full truth and delivered justice to the victim after 27 years. The report also made recommendations: mandatory parallel paper and digital archiving of all criminal files, strict cold storage protocols for evidence, periodic review of backlogged cases, and implementation of the Digital Echo program to digitize all legacy audio evidence. At the press conference, Vermont State Police spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Mark Denton said simply, "The Rachel Linden case reminds us that truth can be buried, but as long as records exist, justice can still be restored." The 2013 cold case report quickly became national training material and marked a turning point in long-term crime investigation. The technical appendix of the 2013 cold case report was devoted entirely to the forensic technologies that solved Rachel Linden's murder, with three core elements highlighted: degraded DNA analysis, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy on the nylon cord, and voice identification via the Voice ID system. It opened with the observation, the fundamental difference between the 1986 and 2013 investigations lies in forensic science capability, technology that turned seemingly meaningless evidence into conclusive proof. For DNA, samples from the cord and victims' bones were severely degraded by decades of cold, moisture, and freeze-thaw cycles. Yet the Vermont Forensic Lab applied mitochondrial DNA amplification. Unlike nuclear DNA, it survives even when original cells are destroyed. The cord contained only trace epithelial cells, less than 1/millionth of a milligram, treated with proteinase K enzyme and amplified through 7 PCR cycles, then compared to Rachel's mother's blood sample. The match was 99.87%, confirming direct contact. The report stressed, using only 1986-1990 DNA technology, these samples would have been untestable. The next section described FTIR spectroscopy to trace the cord's origin. In 1986, investigators could only compare fibers visually under a light microscope and classify by color and diameter. In 2013, technicians used a Nikola TIS-50 FTIR spectrometer to capture the polymer reflection spectrum, measuring C, N, and N, H bond vibrations, yielding an exact match between the Maple Ridge cord and the spool recovered from Ethan Rowe's home. The spectrum identified not just nylon 6, but production batch additives unique to a single New Hampshire factory in 1985. The key physical link across nearly 3 decades. The third section analyzed the FBI-developed Voice ID biometric system. The recovered cassette was water-damaged, noisy, and full of wind interference, but technicians applied multi-layer denoising, isolated human voice frequencies, and ran formant analysis in Voice ID 9.2. The male voice formant structure matched Ethan Rowe's 1986 sample at 96.4% with error below the 3% legal threshold. The report concluded, random match probability is 1 in 480,000, legally sufficient for speaker identification. It was Vermont's first criminal trial acceptance of audio evidence for identity. Additionally, laser-based layer-by-layer magnetic recovery avoided mechanical damage, a technique only available after 2010. The report contrasted the era's 1986 Cedar Hollow team had film cameras and hand measurements with no digital backup, making evidence easily lost. 2013 evidence was digitally barcoded, auto-retrievable, and stored in the National CODIS database. 3D scene reconstruction using GPS and LiDAR terrain scanning recreated slope angles, tree position, and pull direction. The digital map showed the cord scar perfectly matched Rachel's height, supporting the rear attack model. The combination of degraded DNA, FTIR, and Voice ID turned decades-old artifacts into irrefutable proof. The appendix closed with one concise line. If 1986 was the era of human intuition, 2013 was the era when science replaced intuition with quantifiable truth. The Vermont State Police regards this case as a milestone in state forensic history, ushering in an age where any case, no matter how deeply buried by time, can be awakened by a single chord, a voice, and the remaining DNA strands in the darkness of the past. In March 2014, almost 6 months after the Rachel Linden case closed, the Vermont legislature passed Rachel's Law, legislation requiring every missing juvenile report in the state to be opened as a criminal investigation within the first 24 hours, regardless of initial evidence of foul play. The bill was introduced by Addison County Senator Jane Hollister, who had followed the Rowe trial closely, and stated that the delays and wrong assumptions of 1986 caused justice to arrive almost 30 years late. The original draft only mandated reporting to state level, but after Judiciary Committee debate it was expanded. In addition to opening a criminal file within 24 hours, local agencies must notify the Cold Case Division if the victim is not located within 48 hours. The law also requires all evidence from missing persons cases to be preserved for a minimum of 20 years, even if the investigation is suspended. During the public hearing in Montpelier, many lawmakers cited Rachel's case as the classic example of the cost of downplaying early signs. One excerpt from the record read, "Had Cedar Hollow in 1986 treated Rachel Linden's disappearance as a criminal case instead of waiting, she might never have been forgotten in the snow. Governor Charles Wentworth signed the act on March 17, 2014, in a small ceremony at the State House, joined by Detective Sarah Miller and Rachel's mother Sue Linden, who spoke briefly while holding a copy of the law. "My daughter is not coming back, but at least from now on no child in Vermont will disappear without someone looking." Rachel's law took effect July 1, 2014, marking the first time Vermont missing persons procedures became mandatory statute rather than administrative guideline. It also established the Rachel Linden Memorial Fund to finance degraded DNA testing and long-term evidence storage under the Vermont Attorney General's oversight. Statewide media called it one of the most humane and practical laws since the 1990s. In its 2015 annual report, the Vermont State Police noted that juvenile missing persons cases handled within the first 24 hours had doubled, and everyone received a full criminal file. Looking back, Sarah Miller wrote in an internal cold case unit memo, "Rachel's law is not just legislation. It is a reminder that every passing hour can alter a life." On the final page of the act, at Mrs. Linden's request, a small italic line was added, "In memory of Rachel Linden, the girl who forced Vermont to learn never to stay silent when someone goes missing." In the fall of 2014, nearly a year after the law bearing her name took effect, Maple Ridge Lake, the site where Rachel Linden's case had unfolded, was officially designated by the state of Vermont as a memorial for missing persons whose remains have never been found or who were identified only after many years. The trail leading down to the water's edge was repaved with pine planks, and a new brass plaque was erected bearing the simple inscription, "Maple Ridge Memorial," in memory of Rachel Linden, whose truth endured the snow. Beneath it was the date the case was closed. Case closed, 2013. The dedication ceremony was quiet, attended by only a few dozen people, Rachel's family, officers from the cold case unit, and some of those who had taken part in the 1986 search. A gentle wind blew across the calm lake. The birch trees rustled in the late autumn sun, their trunks, once scarred by the rope, now showing only a pale ring of new wood at eye level. Detective Sarah Miller placed a small bouquet of white flowers at the base of the tree, next to Tom Keene's old leather-bound notebook, the one that contained his very first note about rope marks pointing toward the lake. The Linden family stood in silence for a long time, saying nothing. When the ceremony ended, the attendees quietly departed, leaving only the soft sound of water lapping against the rocky shore. The case file, number 861204, was permanently archived in the state repository with the status "Case Closed." 2013, along with the note, "Resolved after 27 years. Conclusion: homicide by ligature strangulation. Convicted, Ethan Rowe." A digital copy was entered into the National Cold Case Archive as an exemplary solved investigation. In her final internal report, Sarah Miller wrote, "No evidence ever truly disappears. It simply waits for someone patient enough to listen." A few months later, she left the Vermont State Police to teach cold case investigation techniques at the Federal Forensic Academy. Every December, the people of Cedar Hollow still bring flowers to Maple Ridge and place them at the water's edge, where the reflection of the birch trees shimmers on the quiet lake. And in the state database, the words "Case Closed, 2013" still appear whenever someone looks up the case. A silent yet complete ending to a long journey of justice that began on a snowy night in 1986, and concluded with a truth no longer buried beneath Vermont's frozen surface. The story of Rachel Linden's case is not only a nearly 3-decade-long investigation, it is also a mirror reflecting responsibility, silence, and the value of societal progress in today's America. The death of a 16-year-old girl, dismissed as just another runaway, exposed the terrifying gaps in the 1980s investigative system, when technology was limited and biases about youthful impulsiveness caused police to act too slowly. The appearance of Detective Sarah Miller almost 30 years later, showed the opposite. Science and determination can restore justice, but nothing can give back the time that was lost. From the discovery of the altered witness statement, the surviving rope marks on the birch tree, to degraded DNA technology and voice ID recognition, everything conveys a clear message: justice exists only when people are willing to look back at their own mistakes. Today, thousands of people still go missing in the United States every year, and many cases are initially downplayed or closed due to lack of evidence of foul play. Rachel's Law, the legislation requiring a criminal investigation within the first 24 hours for every missing minor, was born from that very pain. It reminds Americans that trust in the system cannot be based on waiting. It must be reinforced through action, transparency, and patience. The greatest lesson from Maple Ridge is this: no matter how much technology changes, justice still has to begin with people. People like Sarah Miller, who are willing to return to an old crime scene, confront the mistakes of the previous generation, and prove that the truth, even when buried under decades of snow, can still be found if someone is brave enough to look. Thank you for following us to the end of Rachel Linden's journey, Vermont 1986, where justice was found after nearly 30 years buried beneath the snow. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring cases that seem closed but still whisper the truth in the next video.